I'm very delighted to introduce my co-host today, Madam Helga Zepp-LaRouche from Germany, and she's the founder and president of the Schiller Institute. Madam LaRouche, welcome, and would you please say hi to our audience and introduce your guests on your side?
Yes, hello. I'm here with two eminent China experts. This is Uwe Behrendt, who is author of many books on China. He has spent 27 years in China and other Asian countries, and he's also transport manager. And here is Dr. Wolfram Adolfi, who is also an author of books about China, and he's a political scientist and a journalist.
Well, thank you, Madam LaRouche, and welcome Dr. Behrens and Dr. Adolfi. And in our Beijing studio, we are very delighted to be joined by 5 distinguished guests today. Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Welcome.
Thank you for your invitation.
And Mr. Cui Hongjian, Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Department for European Studies, China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
And Jacques Chaminade, Chairman of the French Party Solidarity and Progress. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Chaminade.
Hello, thank you very much.
And Ms. Zhou Jingzhu, Director and Deputy Research Fellow of International Trade Research Department at CCPIT Academy. Thank you for your time, Ms. Zhou.
Hi, thank you for the invitation.
And we are also delighted to be joined by Bernard de Wit, Chairman of the Belgium Chinese Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for making time for it.
Thank you for your invitation, and hello to everyone.
And thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. And let's start with a look at the economic outlook of China and Europe. European economy is set to narrowly avoid a recession, while China's changes of COVID policies pave the way for a solid recovery. So what is the economic outlook of the two major economies, and how should China and EU work together to promote economic recovery? Let me start with Mr. Geraci. The past year wasn't easy for Europe. How would you evaluate the economy and its outlook, and has the economy turned a corner?
A big challenge still remains because we have got, unfortunately, to a trap. We have low economic growth, which normally would imply that central bank should lower interest rates to stimulate investment. But at the same time, we also have a high inflation, which would suggest, according to the textbook, the central bank should actually increase interest rates. But the third leg of this problem is that inflation is mostly, at least for 50%, driven by high import prices, the cost of energy that we import from Russia, cost that has gone up, not despite, but because of the European sanctions. So in a way, Europe has created part of the inflation by threatening sanctions on import of oil and gas, some of which did not even materialize. But we know the markets reacted when there is the threat of a supply shock, which would be in the case of Russia exiting the global market for energy. This pushes prices up. So the problem is now a trap, because interest rates should not be increased because they don't help at least a lot of the inflation, because input prices of gas will remain, and it could further kill the economic prospect. To add, and I stop, we also have geopolitical tensions with the rest of Asia, and the wrong belief in European circles, not all likely, but many, that the West can do without China and without the other 85% of the population, Asia, Africa, and part of South America, that in a way is connected to China. So we now have BRICS countries where both Argentina, Iran, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Turkey want to join. So this is the big misconception that we have in Europe. In the case of the coupling or raising tensions, we would be better off without the rest of the world. And this is, in my view, entirely wrong assumption that would spell further economic problems.
Indeed, we need broader cooperation to inject fresh impetus in the global economic recovery. And Mr. Cui, China has made economic rebound its priority as the country recently relaxed its COVID policies. So many international institutions have revised up their forecast of China's economy. How has recent government policies trickled down the economy? What might be the risks and uncertainties?
Yes, I think that would be a very good news for our European partners that China is relaxing its COVID-19 policy, and also China also try to take some more time back, just like what happened recently. I think China and the European countries, they are reaching consensus that we need to get more cooperation. But of course, now I think that we need some a process to have this restart of cooperation. Especially we can find out recently, both two sides, China and the European Union and the European countries, we are doing something in a blend process. For example, firstly, the leaders meeting or summit will take place, frequently. I think that will be very, very necessary for both two sides to get a kind of connection on both agenda, and then to have some more common ground. But of course, I think another very important thing for both sides is how could China and Europe we do try to take the value of this cooperation, especially in economic trade and investment. But of course, now I think the very, very big consideration, just like Mr. Jerash mentioned, that how could we avoid any kind of intervention or the trouble from the geopolitical conflict. Indeed. So I think now, yes, we need to have some more confidence for this cooperation, just like what the European side strengthened, that emphasized that not only European economy and also both the cooperation between China and Europe, we need to have some more resilience. What does it mean for resilience? That we need to get some more cooperation to to protect this safety of industry and also supply chain, firstly, and then we should strengthen our existing cooperation. For especially commodity trade. Even in the last 3 years, we achieved, the increase of the trade. And then how could we have some more emerging, or how could we have some more, creation to have some cooperation in some new areas, just like, for example, the green economy, digital economy, and some other. And then I think that last but not least, we need to have some more cooperation with three parties, with the third parties, for example, Africa, Latin America. So we do have more potential, and also we do have, broader vision for our cooperation in the future.
Indeed, both China and Europe plays a vital role in global economic recovery. And Mr. Jacques Cheminade, how do you see the economic outlook of the two sides, and how should China and EU work together to promote economic recovery?
Well, we all know that an epochal change is taking place on the whole planet. Xi Jinping has proposed a global security initiative and a global development initiative. So I would add a global cultural initiative. And to share a culture of explorers, a cooperation of all cultures, each bringing the best to the others, would be what defines our future. It means also to explore the culture of the others. We are all on the same boat. So let's also explore together, us Europeans and Chinese, the cultures of the global South, from Indonesia to Brazil, from India to Mexico, or to Africa. It's the best approach to promote a mutual understanding and trust for the advantage of us all, for the advantage of the other, as the first point of the Chinese position on the settlement of Ukraine's crisis states to respect the sovereignty of all countries, defending international fairness and justice, and abandoning forever the Cold War mentality, to think with a positive vision of a future age of reason based on a new international architecture promoting development and security. And I think that if we stick to this approach, we can really define a future age of reason for our world.
Indeed, we're in this boat together, as you mentioned. And Ms. Zhou, I'd like to have your take on China and EU economic outlook, in particular as you are an expert in international trade. How do you see the momentum of China-EU trade and its role in economic recovery of both sides?
Well, we can see some good news and some bad news. Well, in the first year of this, the 1st January of this year, we can see that global manufacturing PMI, while ended a downward trend, was 49.2% and up 0.6 percentage points from the previous months. Well, the good news is that the accelerated recovery of China's manufacturing industry contributed to a major force to the stabilization of the global economy. While the sustained slight recovery of the Eurozone manufacturing industry also helped to alleviate the downward pressure of the global economy, especially France and Italy. While these two countries' PMI were about 50%. But the bad news is from the PMI of the America, well, still below 50% and continued to decline. I'm worried about as the major market, the weak demand of the United States would dampen the export of China and Europe.
Indeed, trade is vital to both economies. And Mr. Dawit, let's talk a bit more about this relationship between the two sides. The European Commission pointed out that Europe's external demand could turn out to be more robust following China's changes to COVID policies. What's your comment on that, and how important is China-EU partnership to economic stability of both sides and world economy?
Well, I think the big changes that are coming have been shown already by the trip of some European leaders to China. Mr. Geraci mentioned it. We had the visit of Mr. Michel. We had the visit of Mr. Chancellor Scholz. That shows that Europe is willing to maintain a dialogue and go further in cooperation with China, I think. There are a lot of challenges. There are some difficulties. We have seen it, but now we are in the post-COVID era. What we see also on the ground is more and more business people traveling from China to Europe and from Europe to China. We foresee several economic missions starting from May until the end of the year. There are many economic fairs, commercial fairs taking place in China where European companies will come. We hope that also Chinese companies will come to our fairs here in Europe. So that is, I think, a big change from the previous years. That makes me relatively optimistic for a little bit of change of mentalities. This being said, there is a tendency to protectionism, and some people think that by putting barriers, by putting borders, it will help. Personally, I think no. And as Mr. Cheminade very rightly said, we need to open our minds, and the opening of the borders will help to that. And that, I think, will help also a quicker economic recovery, even though there are challenges, but I think we can be relatively optimistic.
Indeed, and that is certainly what the business would like to see, a more certain economic and policy outlook. And now let's cross over to our German studio, and Madame LaRouche now joins us with two experts in Germany. Hi there, Madame LaRouche. What is your take on the economic outlook of China and Europe? As our experts have mentioned, the importance of cooperation, the importance of keeping supply chains open, and the importance to scale down the escalations and stick to peaceful development.
I think Europe is clearly at a crossroad because, you know, the European economic situation in reality is very difficult. I mean, we had COVID, we have the war in Ukraine, we have the sanctions against Russia. This has caused an incredible energy price inflation. And, the danger is of deindustrialization of Europe. China, on the other side, especially since the change in the COVID policy, is on a solid road to better growth. And I think it's absolutely vital in the European self-interest to clearly see that the economic dynamic has shifted to Asia. Many people in the business community are aware of that Asia is where the economic momentum is taking place. You have the BRI, which is an incredible engine of the world economy, and China also being part of the BRICS. You are now talking about BRICS Plus. The latest I heard is that 22 countries have applied to be members in the BRICS. So that makes the BRI BRICS Plus complex by far the strongest economic factor in the world economy. And if Europe wants to get out of its present calamities, it absolutely should cooperate with the BRICS, with the BRI, especially, and I think this was mentioned by Mr. Ceracchi correctly, joint ventures, rather than trying to, decouple or to make block building. I think it would be extremely important for the European economies to cooperate, joint ventures in the reconstruction of Southwest Asia, which has been destroyed by many wars, in the economic buildup of Africa, which is the continent of the future. I think there are vast opportunities for Europe if people, decide to be part of that new dynamic, a new paradigm which is emerging. Now I want to ask Herr Behrens, you have been traveling and working in China for many years. What is your take?
Okay, thank you for this question. I would like to have a look on the German economy, because in the recent figures of the International Economic Institution say that the German economy most probably will not grow, just in opposite, it will give, we will have a certain recession. And this has, to my opinion, different reasons. One, these are internal reasons. In Germany, we missed to push up the digitalization. We have a shortage in this development of digitalization. We have a shortage in education of profession for the industry of the 21st century. These are the internal problems. The external problem, of sure, are those questions like the pandemic, that the supply chains were interrupted, that certain products which are necessary for the production in Europe couldn't arrive on time, shortage of certain products happened. But further problem are this American policy now, this American Inflation Reduction Act, which actually cause to lure certain German industry to America, and this of sure has a very strong impact on the growth of the German economy. So when we see all this, I think we have only one way out of this: to increase the cooperation, to use the chance the Chinese economy offers now, that the Chinese economy will grow, will in the coming year, and in this year 2023, will have a fast development. We will see when we hear the target for this year that there are many possibilities for the German economy, for the German industry to get more close with the Chinese economy. It would be a big mistake to talk about this decoupling at the moment. Just in opposite. We have to find out in what industries we have to work together. When we see the industry or the development of the foreign direct investment from Germany to China. So happened it that last year this German investment in China increased by 92% compared with the year before. But this 92% only to certain companies or certain industry areas. For example, chemical industry, automotive industry, food processing, and mainly to 10 big companies. This has to change. The small and middle-sized companies have to use the chance to work more intensive with the Chinese industry and to use the chance, this growing, what we expect, this growing for this year, to jump on this train and grow together with the Chinese economy.
Okay, that's very interesting. And what do you think about this?
Now, I strongly support what Mr. Cheminade said, because he spoke about the cultural background for all that and about the thinking and the general approach to the problem, and combined with what Mr. Behrens said about the economy and these different fields of industry, we need this thinking in the kind of global governance, and to find together and to cope together with the problem of the different crises. So I fully support what Mr. Cheminade said, and it is the general approach, I guess, of the participants of the discussion. So.
Well, Heike, I'm very glad that your guests all pointed out the importance of cooperation and communication between China and EU. But there are one more question for you, but shortly. Now, there are more question marks on the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. What is your take on this, and what's the implication for German economy?
Well, I think this is huge because the lack of the cheap Russian gas means that Germany is now importing LNG from the United States, which is 4 times as expensive. As a result of it, many small and medium industries are going bankrupt, and many have warnings out that they will go bankrupt in the coming year. So I think the impact of that is absolutely devastating. But there is another dimension to that, and that is that if the revelations of the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh turn out to be true, I mean, he says that he has proof that it was the United States and Norway who cooperated in the sabotage of Nord Stream 2. Now, if that turns out to be confirmed, and there needs to be an international investigation, obviously, this would be extremely corrosive for the trust in the EU and NATO. And it may even call into question the existence of these 2 institutions in the present form. I think that is definitely something one should not forget in the coming period.
Indeed, Mr. LaRouche. I think Europe needs an independent investigation of the incident. And the relations between China and EU undoubtedly is one of the most important in the world. China's top diplomat Wang Yi just wrapped up his trip to Europe, and this came amid further straining of China-US ties. So how is China-EU relations evolving in a changing world? How would EU balance its policies amid rising geopolitical tensions? To get more insights on this, let me turn to Mr. Geraci first, before you go. China's top diplomat Wang Yi says his trip to Europe aims to showcase China's commitment to peaceful development. How is the message received by European countries, and how do you assess the status of China-EU ties, especially considering the United States continue to describe China as a growing challenge or even a threat?
Thank you very much. Yes, I have to leave in a couple of minutes, but I think it's been taken positively, because I think in Europe, the problem in Europe that we have all discussed are getting so big and so out of control that luckily some leadership in Europe starts to refocus on trying to do the interest of the European citizen. I speak for my own country. I've also had a chance to talk to the Italian foreign minister before he met with Wang Yi in Rome a couple of weeks ago. And there is, I can tell you, a rework of the relationship between Italy and China. We are starting to reconsider that the Belt and Road is an initiative of peace, of development, of infrastructure in those countries. Southeast Asia was mentioned, rest of Asia and Africa. That there are, yes, some risk, but there are not more than the normal risk that countries incur when they borrow money from international organizations, whether it's the World Bank, IMF, and so on and forth. So the balance is shifting back, at least the perception of the balance shifting back, that there are more opportunities than risks. Ms. Elga Aroshi just spoke about the 22 countries applying for BRICS. Again, another parallel arm of an initiative of the Belt and Road together with the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank and so on. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, sorry. So we are seeing a growing refocus on doing business. Get rid of the ideology, East, West, liberal democracy, non-liberal democracy. Every country does what they want in their own country. It's up to the people to decide what they like. And then everyone is free and should be encouraged to interact with each other, because trade, exchange of knowledge, travels, exchange of people, students, professors, scientists, increases knowledge. And when we increase knowledge, we lower the risk. And when we lower the risk, the value of the business increases. So I do see a turning point, an inflection point. We still, of course, need to do the second step to persuade also our American allies that it is also in their own interest not to argue with China. And I think they are also starting to understand this. So I want to be positive that things are warming up again in the right direction.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us. And Mr. Cui, I know that in January, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen talked about the need to de-risking with China instead of decoupling from China. How do you assess China-EU ties? And what is your observation of the dynamics?
Also, recently, indeed, there has been a discussion within European countries to say that how to evaluate the risk for European economy and industry in a world full of the geopolitical tensions. Also, I understand there is a kind of a deep worry from some European countries about the so-called weaponization of trade, economic ties, investment between major partners. I think, but firstly, I think this kind of bad experience from of the European countries, rightly, is from the United States. As we know, especially during the Trump administration, European countries suffered a lot from this kind of weaponization of trade from American administration. And then, of course, as we understand, because of the Ukrainian crisis, it has strengthened the worry of the European countries about the so-called weaponization of energy, just a tactic from Russia. So I think it's maybe for some European people, it's a very natural imagination that perhaps China will do the same thing. China is trying to perhaps weaponize the trade and the very close economic ties with Europe to achieve its political goals. I understand what's the worry in it, but I don't agree with this logic, because firstly, China and the European countries, we enjoyed very, very good economic and trade relations in the past more than 40 years. It's in the interest of China. I don't think there is any reason for China to follow up any kind of weaponization of trade or the economic ties, just like what happened between Europe and the United States. And secondly, I think that so-called de-risking the so-called industry or economy of the European Union. How could we find the right way to have maybe economic security? I think it's it's a challenge for both China and Europe. How could we do? I think the right way is we should strengthen our cooperation. We should, have some more connectivity, and to strengthen our capability to deal with any kind of weaponization of the economic and trade ties from other maybe parts. I think that will be the right way. So I hope that with the more and more, communication between China and the European side, we can achieve some more, mutual understanding about this issue, and hopefully that we need to find out a right way for both sides, as we always, insist that we need to be part of so-called, the more healthy globalization, and also by insisting the multilateralism.
And there we need more communication. And Mr. Wang Yi's visit to Europe certainly has gone in that direction. Mr. Chaminade, how does France perceive China? Do you see China more as a strategic partner, or is it more of an economic competitor, or even systemic rivalry?
So the answer is very simple. The growth of China is a positive point for the whole world. And it is terrible to see in Great Britain or the United States a fear that this is a threat. It's absolutely the contrary. A community of development is our future. And it is now the point, I hope, in France, that something is going to take place. Emmanuel Macron announced that he's going to China in April. The Chinese ambassador in France, Liu Shaye, said that we warmly welcome the timely visit of President Macron. So it's timely for France and it's timely for Europe. And I hope that this time words would follow, and beyond words, acts would follow what President Macron has been saying, and we expect acts and we expect a future.
Thank you. And Ms. Zhou, how has the business environment evolved in China and Europe in recent years, and how are businesses adapting to it?
Our Chinese government values the business environment construction. Both the Ministry of Commerce and our China Council for the Promotion of International Trade, CCPIT, set up the working team for the business facilitation for the foreign enterprises in China, and collecting their difficulties in the operation and their suggestions, and we report it to the central government to seeking the solutions. While China is pursuing the institutional opening up system by improving the foreign investment management based on the pre-establishment national treatment and the negative list, while by opening up the service sectors while applying the way. And we also want to foster a market-oriented and world-class business environment underpinned by a sound law framework. But while, in my opinion, in the past few years, the EU saw a rise in protectionism and the negative tendency of decoupling with China and respective trade blocs, as well as do not have the good impact on the supply chain. Well, in the 2022, while we can see the EU has basically formed a comprehensive review mechanism, covering the foreign investment review, foreign subsidy review, and public procurement review, anti-circumvention investigation, cybersecurity review, and so on, involving the trade in goods, trade in services, investment, public procurement, and cyberspace and other areas of the market. Well, I caught that the EU has already erected a three-dimensional protection barrier around the internal market. Well, in order to fully reflect the voices of the Chinese enterprises in Europe, our CCPIT Academy has already conducted a survey on the business environment of the EU for the 5 consecutive years. And we distributed several hundred of the enterprises in EU, well, our Chinese enterprises, and also do the surveys. And according to our survey, that shows 46% of the respondents believe that the barriers to the market access of the EU has been raised a lot. And 40% of them have already changed their investor plans because of the EU foreign investment review. And there are those still the numbers that we cannot ignore, that by the end of the 2021, the Chinese enterprises had set up 2,700 commercial presences with the direct investment in the EU and their member states. And also these commercial presences providing 207,000 jobs for the local residents. So we can see the Chinese companies still full of the enthusiasm and expectations for the improving of the EU environment in the business.
And there's still more potential to explore for bilateral investment. And Mr. David, what is your take on this? How are Belgian businesses perceiving the opportunities and challenges in the China market?
Well, I would say that, first of all, as a European, I must say that with my eyes, I see that China made a big effort first to join the WTO, now more than 20 years ago. And that was a huge effort for China to suppress a big number of barriers that were existing before. And what we see now is people saying, well, we Europeans, all Americans, well, Americans are not concerned, but we Europeans should not abide by WTO rules. Now that China has been economically stronger, I think a positive point is that the Chinese government, and Madame Zhou mentioned it, the Chinese government has continued with an opening up policy on the economic point of view. And that is very important. And now I think the challenge for our European companies is to have more SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises involved in the business with China. But because during the COVID times, we saw that trade with China even grew up, but that the big companies, the large companies, were taking a major role. Now, I think the challenge will be to have more Chinese SMEs involved in Europe and European SMEs involved in China. And for that, well, only one solution: more exchanges, big role of universities, that we begin again to have our students going to Chinese universities, Chinese students to our universities. We have to open our gates on cultural education point of view, because we are then forming the future. We see also that many people in Europe still don't know anything about China, don't realize the evolution of China, don't realize the possibilities China is offering. And that is, I think, the challenges for the coming years. And now that with the COVID barriers coming down, we have their opportunities.
Indeed, I believe that if they come to China, we'll certainly see China as a friend instead of a competitor or rivalry. And now let's go live to Germany, where my co-host Helga Zepp-LaRouche now joining us with her guests. Madame LaRouche, I'd like to get your take first on China-EU relations, especially how is the further straining of China-US relationship affecting China-EU ties?
Well, I think Europe is right now under enormous pressure from the United States, and not to forget Great Britain. They are pushing practically decoupling, which would be devastating. I mean, the more rational people in Europe are completely aware that the decoupling of the European economies from China is completely impossible. It would mean the immediate plunge into a deindustrialization. So I think that there is right now an effort to have a better relationship. Ursula von der Leyen, speaking for the EU Commission, she is pushing not decoupling but diversification. But I think that's not good enough. I mean, I think what is needed is an overall design. Where should humanity go? We are the creative species. We are the only species on the planet which is gifted with creative reason, and we should be able to give ourselves an order which allows the peaceful cooperation of all nations. And if you look at it that way, then the development of all nations and all continents will be a necessity. With other words, why should Africa, Latin America, Asia not have the same kind of infrastructure density as we saw it, I must say, in the best times in Germany or in other countries which have a similar degree of development. And I think if you have a long-term vision that the world eventually will overcome poverty, will overcome underdevelopment, that every nation will have a modern health system in order to be able to fight pandemics, as well as China proved to have been able to fight the COVID pandemic. Every nation needs a health system like that. And if you have a perspective that eventually, all nations will be moderately wealthy, all children will have access to universal education, and that requires certain investments in industry, in agriculture, in infrastructure, then, if you look at it as a dynamic process, there is room for everybody. I think this idea that you have to have new blocks and, that you have to divide the world again in Cold War kind of Iron Curtain, which some people are really pushing, I think that's a completely outdated idea. And I think that the future of the world will be, cooperating in all of these projects. And I know that my experts here from Germany have a likewise idea. So, Herr Behrens, what is your view on this?
Yeah. In recent time, we heard those wording like de-risking. What does de-risking mean? I would like to interpret it in a positive way. When we want to reduce the risk of trade problems, the risk of increasing poverty, so then we have to cooperate more international, more multilateral. And Madame Larouche said it already, this New Silk Road initiative, this Belt and Road initiative. China showed us building up infrastructure is a base for industrialization. And the industrialization is a base for increasing the living standard of the people. This worldwide in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia has to be done. So when we want to talk about de-risking, then we should work together to develop those countries that we can spread our trade all over the world. And this is much better than to keep this wording de-risking as a synonym for French sourcing. So we should see it positive, and we should work on international cooperation, not seeing this global partnership of investment and infrastructure, which the American President Joe Biden initiated last June during the G7 conference as a measure against China, but just better together to work together with China to solve those problems.
Mr. Adolfi, you have some views, I'm sure.
Yeah, I would come back to this idea of knowing about each other. I was happy enough to be the first time in 1978 in Beijing to make my first studies there. So since almost 45 years, I'm looking into the country and I'm writing and speaking about it. And by doing so, I of course learn every day that there is a lot of people who don't know very much about the country, and so it is a good idea and a good task to speak about the country, to speak about the own experience, to speak about the close contacts, and of course at the same time to warn about the thinking of a new bloc confrontation. In my working with China, we had these bloc confrontations and we had these different situations, and we had enemy images and others, but it has been overcome in the last decades, and it would be very deplorable if there would be a new confrontation. So I fully agree. We have to link the trade and the cultural efforts to think about each other and to work together, cooperation and not confrontation.
Well, Haga and Dr. Adobe and Dr. Barron, thank you very much for promoting the understanding in Europe about China, and we certainly would like to initiate more communications like this in the future to contribute to this. And China and EU is set to see frequent high-level mutual visits soon, which will send a strong signal of China-EU cooperation. How can China and EU renew the strategic partnership, and in what areas should the two sides deepen cooperation and advance our shared interests? Let me turn to Mr. Cui first. How do you suggest China and EU can manage their differences while maintaining positive relations and advance our shared interests?
I think firstly, we need to realize, certainly, there has been some huge change, not only because of the environment for regional and global level, and also now for both China and Europe, we do have also some change, or updation of our goals and also policies. So we need to have some, more communication. Firstly, we need to understand what's the real meaning of this policy change and also environmental change. And secondly, I think we need to find out some more, pillars to support our cooperation. Just like what happened in the past between China and the European Union, we developed, this three pillars cooperation in a sense of strategic and also economic and also people-to-people contact. But now, of course, we need to continue this kind of more cooperation and to promote the common interests, especially in economy, trade, investment. But at the same time, us both two powers to support the peaceful development for the world. We also now, we also needed to have some more common responsibilities to support, the peaceful development in Europe, in Asia, and also at a global level. Just like what happened recently, that I think for China and the European countries and the European Union, not only we need to promote our economic cooperation, and also we need to share some more responsibilities to support or to help any kind of situation in regional, conflict, or also to, promote the global, peace and also the stability. So I think that would be a big potential for both China and Europe once we have some more, common grounds.
Indeed. And Mr. Chaminade, how do you promote mutual understanding and trust between China and Europe through cultural and people-to-people exchanges, and in what areas can China and France work together in the future?
Well, two patriotic currents, left and right, on the French and European political spectrum, welcome China's position on the settlement of the Ukraine crisis. So this opens the way for a dialogue inspired by the future. We have to intensify exchanges to better know each other and European and Chinese histories. Let's then have a political dialogue on organizing European Chinese mixed teams of students, engineers, experts, scientists on all fields, from agriculture, aerospace, environment, in artificial intelligence, and in the field of nuclear energy. My French friends who organized the shared development of China and France said that these mixed teams work very well. At the beginning, the Chinese and the French were separate. And at the end, when the process developed, they were integrated, and Chinese and French were together in teams and working together. So this is a matter of creating confidence. The other point is what Helga Zepler-Rouge stressed. People are suffering in this world. So we need both Europeans and Chinese, and with a French intervention in that area, if Emmanuel Macron does what he should do. We need this dialogue for a global food and health security in the world, for all the people in this world. So this is a challenge, and we should accomplish good things together for the advantage of all the others in this world. And if I hope that this time, as I said before, acts will follow the words. I want to conclude, I don't know if I have to say something on the political parties and the cooperation of political parties. So I leave at this point if you ask me a question on this issue.
Well, I hope China can play a positive role in the settlement of this crisis. And Mrs. Zhou, could you share with us some of the most significant highlights of this partnership in areas such as trade, investment, and technology?
Yes. Well, China-EU cooperation has enjoyed broad space and many opportunities. There are 4 areas worth our attention. In my opinion, the first one is the third-party market cooperation, while Dr. Cui and Mr. Rachi have just mentioned before. While China and the EU have complementary industrial chains and a good faith between the two parties. And for example, while China and France both agreed to accelerate the implementation of a list of the 4th round of demonstration projects for the third-party market cooperation, and the list contains 7 projects, while in the infrastructure, environmental protection, new energy, and so on. And these projects involved a number of Chinese and French enterprises and financial institutions participate. The second area is the China-Europe Railway Express. While with the tight capacity in the global sea and air freight markets in the last year, while the advantages of land transport of the China-Europe Railway Express have continued to emerge. And the express is 1/3 faster than the traditional sea transportation, and its cost is just only 1/4 of the air transport. The third one is the China-Europe cooperation in science, technology, and innovation, we call it STI. And this cooperation, I think, has great potential with a good foundation for the STI cooperation and a good history since 1981. While China and Europe have both realistic needs and real benefits to gain from such cooperation, while in the areas such as the energy, agriculture, the biotechnology, and the health medicine, and so on. And the fourth area, but it's the most important one, is to reopen the EU's ratification process of the China-EU investment agreement. While it is recommended that the EU resume the ratification process of the China-EU investment agreement as soon as possible, and the early signing of the agreement to provide a more transparent domestic regulation and more liberalized market access for the two-way investment, and further deepen the China-EU economic ties. Because according to our surveys, that if the investment agreement is ratified and implemented, 41% of the Chinese enterprises will increase their investment in the EU market.
Mr. David, do you see the possibility of the launching of the signing of this China-EU investment agreements?
Well, I think this agreement is very important, and Madame Zhou very rightly mentioned it. I think among the business community, among companies doing business with China in Europe, or Chinese companies doing business with Europe, there's a big majority of businessmen who would like this agreement to be implemented. Now, we know also that politically it's more sensitive, and the European Parliament has its say on this. So personally, I would expect some time. The French former President Mitterrand said, give time to time, but you will need some time. But in the meantime, I think we should focus on what we have in common. What we have in common are the common challenges we are facing. And it has been said, the climate change, the poverty alleviation, the health issues, the cooperation with third countries, all this are possibilities we have immediately. We see also in the cooperation we have in Belgium, for instance, on the logistics part. We have a big Chinese investment in our port of Antwerp. In the airport of Liège, we have Alibaba having put a very important hub. We are profiting from that. And when we go to China, our companies, what we see with our Belgian-Chinese Chamber of Commerce is that most of our members remained members, which means they continued to do business with China, even though you had 3 years of COVID crisis. That means that most of the people in the business community believe in China, believe in developing further their ties with China, which would be of common interest, of common benefit. And last thing I wanted to mention, the tourism issue. We will now see more and more Chinese tourists coming to Europe. That's economically very interesting for us. We hope that a certain number of European tourists will go again to China. So that is typically something where we both can profit.
And that are seeing positive development. And let me now go live to Madame Helga Zepp-LaRouche in Germany. Madame LaRouche, could you share with us first what are some of the key areas where the two sides can ally in terms of shared values and interest?
I think that one thing which is urgently needed is that we make an effort that the people on both sides, China and Europe, know more about each other, because, you know, I think this has been said by several people that the knowledge is not sufficient. My experience is, and Mr. Adolfi, you said this earlier, that, you know, you have been in China for the first time in 71. I outdo you. I was the first time there in 71. And I have studied Chinese culture, you know, I know you have done likewise. And when you find out the beauty of Chinese poetry, Chinese painting, which is very different from European painting, Chinese literature, the Confucian philosophy, I mean, you cannot explain the Chinese foreign policy and domestic policy without taking into account the rich tradition of Confucianism over 2,500 years. People have to study that to understand what are the motives of China, because, you know, the demonization or the portraying of China as a negative factor in the world only functions if people don't know what is the truth. And, you know, likewise, you know, Europe of today is not exactly representing its best traditions, which I would say is the Italian Renaissance, the French École Polytechnique, the German classical period in music and poetry. And I think that if one would make a very conscious effort, like Jacques Cheminade said earlier, to have exchange of students, scholars, experts, to, you know, really make sure that you understand the other culture, I think the reaction would be that all European nations would start to love China. And I think what we have to do is we have to go back to the philosophy of Leibniz. You know, this was the great philosopher, German philosopher of the 17th and 18th century. And he had the beautiful idea when he found about Chinese culture from the Jesuits and from Emperor Kangxi. He said, isn't it a beautiful coincidence that the two greatest cultures are located in the outer ends of the Eurasian continent, Europe and China, and they should reach out and join hands and then develop all the countries in between them, and naturally also in the south. So I think if we would go back to this spirit of Leibniz, I think there's no problem we cannot surpass. I think you would agree with that.
Totally agree. I would like to mention, when I returned to Germany after 27 years living in Asia, mainly in China, I was surprised how distorted the picture of China in the German mind was. Everybody believed China would like to bring the Chinese culture to Germany. China wants to be the new world power and has only this intention to spread to Europe. But this is mainly to the media. The media don't give a real picture what has happened in China. For example, today in the newspaper I could read 125 new coal power plants are opened or rebuilt. But it's not written that this is only a backup for emergency, and it's with the newest technology. It's some news were here spreaded which are not in the right context to see. So since I realized this after I returned back to Germany, I thought I have to do something. So I wrote 2 books about China and about my experience in China. And more important is, after these books, I got invited for presentations. And I'm very happy that after a certain time, also more young people ask. Especially now, just last week, I was invited by a university and I talked in front of students, and the students were very, very surprised how the real situation is in China and how the differences in culture, the European and the Chinese culture are, but how many common things we have, how many things we can do together and we can understand together. So this is one point, but I think we have to do. We have to explain, and we have to find out what are the common and what is our target for our world community, for the entire world.
Herr Adolfi.
I would just come back to the war in Ukraine. And I think there is, by this Chinese initiative, by this Chinese peace initiative, there is a big chance to think about China's role in the world and in peacekeeping, that people here better understand that this conflict cannot be solved without the help of the international community, and there must be different approaches to the conflict to find a way out, because there is a global feeling and a global consciousness that this war tends to grow up to maybe a world war, and so it is very, very important to see the Chinese initiative and to see how strongly and seriously the Chinese leaders follow their line of thinking about global governance and about global solution of global conflicts.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madame Larouche, and your guests. Thank you for your friendship and trust. We know there are a lot of misunderstanding about China. We hope China and Europe would dispel external disruptions properly manage differences and strengthen communication and cooperation to contribute to world peace, stability, and sustainable development, and to share extensive common interests and shoulder great responsibility for global governance. And that would do it for our special program, China-Europe Ties, Exploring New Heights. I'm Guanxin in Beijing. Many thanks to our guests today, Madame LaRouche, Dr. Behrens, Dr. Adopi, and Mr. Cui Hongjian, Mr. Chaminade, Ms. Zhou, and Mr. Dewitt. We appreciate your comments and insights. And this program is co-organized by CGTN Think Tank and Schiller Institute in Germany. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, bye for now.